Welcome to today's sunny RootsMagic webinar. My name is Michael Booth, and I'm Vice President of RootsMagic and one of its developers. And also with us this afternoon is the Roots Magician himself, Bruce Busby. And Bruce, of course, is the President of RootsMagic and its author. Now, RootsMagic 5 is the latest version of our award-winning software which makes recording, documenting, and sharing your family history easy. And based on user feedback, lots of testing, version 5 makes adding, managing, and editing source documentation easier than ever before. And today, we're going to have a short look at the changes and improvements which have been made to our source and citation features. And with that introduction, I'll turn the time over to Bruce.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay, so as Mike mentioned, what we're going to be talking about are some of the new items and the changes that we've made to sources and citations in RootsMagic 5. Now, we won't be going into as much detail on this one as we have in the past. If you go back to look at previous webinars, we've had a webinar dedicated to sources that lasted, I believe it was 90 minutes. We're not intending to spend that much time. As you mentioned, everybody likes the little bit shorter ones. And so we're going to concentrate on the stuff that's new. Now, that being said, we will talk about adding and editing sources. And so let's go ahead and jump right in. I am going to go to Howard Smith Sr., and I'm going to open up his edit screen. Now, when you want to add a source to a piece of information, you can add a source to an individual. That would be a general source or a person source. You can add sources to families, and you can add sources to any fact, any event or property for that person here. Now, when you go into the person's edit screen, you'll have a list of the person and their spouses and parents and all of their facts, and you'll have a column right here that has the little certificate up here above this particular column. This column is going to be the source column. So if I have a source for one of these pieces of information, I'm going to have a check mark right there in that column. Now, one of the things that we've added in RootsMagic 5 is little hover hints. So if I happen to have a check mark, for example, in the birth source column, if I move my mouse pointer over that, you'll see it pops up the source. If I move on down, it's going to show me there's a census source. As I go down to the death, you're going to see that there's a book. Now, if there's multiple sources, I will see the multiple sources listed there in that little hint. So that's a new feature that we've added in RootsMagic 5 so that you don't have to go click that check mark just to see quickly what sources there are. Okay, so I'm going to come in and I want to add a source for his birth. Now, there's already one source. When I hover, you can see I've already got a book that I have his birth information from. And to add a source or to see the sources, I can either click to highlight this fact, and then that brings up all of his birth information, and I can click the Sources button right here. If I do that, that brings up my Citation Manager to show me all the birth sources I have for Howard. There's also a shortcut. If I click on the little check mark, that's going to bring up that same screen. That's going to bring up the sources for his birth right there. So I've brought this up, and I can see I have this book, and on page 100, and so I can see the information about the footnote, the short footnote, the bibliography, and I can see research notes and so on for this particular source. What I want to do, though, is I'm going to add a new source. So I can either say I want to add a new source, in other words, I'm going to type it in from scratch, or I can cite an existing source, which means I've already typed this particular source in, and I'm just going to reuse it. So let's start. This time I'm going to add a new source. RootsMagic is going to ask me what type of source. These are source templates based on evidence explained. So you don't have to memorize what a source looks like, what a particular source type looks like. You can just come in here and select one of these source types, and RootsMagic will pop up a fill in the blanks field for you, and you can fill it in. You also have a free-form source, so if you just want to type it in your own way and not worry about templates, you can do that as well. Now, there's about 500 different source types in here, and I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this. What you can do is you can actually set source types as favorites. So if you found one of the source types in this list that's a favorite, you select it and you click the little star, and that will make it a favorite. So I'm just going to come here to favorites, and I'm going to see ones I've already selected. And one of the ones I've actually set as a favorite that I use a lot are vital records, local certificates. In other words, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, things that are held at the local level. Local meaning county or city, township, whatever. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say I want to add a vital record, and RootsMagic is going to bring up my source citation screen to go ahead and enter this source. So let's go ahead and type this in. Okay, the jurisdiction, county and state. I'm going to say this is Avon County, Iowa. The series, if I don't know something, I can leave it blank. The repository, County Health Department. And the repository location, we'll call that Avon, Iowa. Actually, Avon's the city up here, so I actually want to do this Polk County, Iowa. Okay, now this top part is the master source. That's the part I can reuse. So I don't have to type in Polk County, Iowa, County Health Department, Avon, Iowa, every time I find a birth certificate or a death certificate or a marriage license from Polk County. I just enter this the one time. The bottom half are going to be the details. This is the part that's different each time I use it. So in this case, what I happen to be entering is a birth certificate. And let's say that certificate number is 123-45. You know, obviously you want to use the real certificate number and the certificate date. And I don't happen to remember off the top of my head, but I could go look at the death. And I'm going to go ahead and put in January 1st, 1899. And the ID of the person, Howard Smith Sr. Now, as I fill these fields in, you'll notice RootsMagic is writing the properly formatted footnote, the short footnote, and the bibliography for me. You don't even need to worry about what a footnote, a short footnote, and a bibliography are. One, because RootsMagic is going to write them for you as you fill in the blanks. And two, because when you print a report, RootsMagic knows which of these to actually use. Now I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now there's other items along here that we're going to come back to and talk about later. But I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And RootsMagic is going to ask me to give this master source a name. Okay, in other words, so that I can reuse it. So I'm going to go ahead and put Vital Records, Iowa, Polk County. Now I'm entering it like this, but you can enter it however you want. What this is used for is in the master source list, this is going to be the name that RootsMagic uses to sort that list by. So by putting vital records first, it's going to group all of my vital records together. And then by putting the state next, it's going to group all of my Iowa vital records together. And then it's going to have Polk County. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And it has now saved it. There's my vital records. There's my footnote, short footnote, bibliography. And there's the specific details. This was a birth certificate. That's the number, the date, and the person. And so now I have two different source citations for his birth. Okay, when I go ahead and close out of this and come back to the screen, when I hover over his birth, you're going to see I now show the book and those vital records. So I can actually see all of the different sources that I have for his birth right here. Okay, now I'm going to go back into this screen. I'm going to go back in, and I'm actually going to go ahead and edit this book source. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to click on Edit, and we're going to use this to kind of talk about some of these other items that you can add for your source. Now, if you happen to use RootsMagic 4, you will know that in RootsMagic 4, we didn't have tabs here. We had this particular screen, and then we had a bunch of buttons. We had a button that said more about the master source and more about the citation, the source details. And when you clicked on those, it dropped down menus, with text and comments and media. And we had other buttons for repository and quality. Things were just kind of scattered all over the place. But what we've done is we've brought them up into the tabs to make it easier to find the information that you've entered. In other words, we tried not to hide it so well. So in addition to this citation screen where I have my master source and my source details, I can look at master text, which is going to be information about this master source. I can click on the detailed text, which is going to be about this use of this source, and then media quality and repository. So let's just go into each one of them. For the master text, I can have a source ID. And this is if I happen to have taken, if I happen to have some reference number that I want to apply to this master source, I can do this. Okay. I can also enter text about this source generally and comments about this source. So in this case, we're actually talking about a book, a basic format book. So your master text, these are going to be things that apply to the master source. So anything I enter or change on this screen is going to change every place I've used this source. So source text might be something generally about the book. It might be the table of contents of the book. It might be an introduction to the book. So it's something that's general to the book as a whole. Okay, my comments might be comments about the book, what quality the book is in, any comments about the author of the book. Maybe there's a bias that we need to take into consideration. So these are going to be items that are going to refer to the book as a whole. Okay, the next tab, detailed text, this is going to be information that is specific to what I just used this source for. Okay, in other words, the source is this book, but the details are that on page 100, his birth, that's what we're using it for, his birth is mentioned on page 100 of this book. So if I go in here, I have my research notes, and those research notes are going to be some type of a summary of what was found in this book about his birth, a transcription, extraction, anything where I take something from the text of this source and enter it in. And then I'm going to also have comments about how I used this. So for example, in this book, this is about his birth, I may take a quote from this book about his birth. And so in this book, it might say, the following is from an entry in Melanie's journal dated June 9th, 1861. I delivered Howard on June 9th, 1861 during a blinding snowstorm. The doctor couldn't get here through the snow. Or it even might have said, I delivered Howard today. But the fact that it was dated on that date, that helps give us information about his birth date. Then we can have comments, which is not something we extracted or transcribed from the source, and that's where we can say Melanie is assumed to be Melanie Smith, Howard's older sister, or Melanie is known to be Melanie Smith, Howard's older sister, if in that journal it says that. Okay, she would have been 15 at the time. So these, in this, you have a place to enter your actual research notes, how you used this particular source to provide this data you're looking for, and your comments about how you use that. Okay, let's move on to the media tab. Now, last week we did a webinar on media, and so I would refer you back to that for details on how this page works. But this actually lets you have media for the source. This might be a picture of the book, or media about the details of this book. This might be a scanned image of that page that had that research note information that we extracted out of the book. So this is where you're going to put scanned images of your source. Okay. Quality. This is where you're going to tell how good this source is for what you're using it for. Okay. Now, some programs, when it comes to quality, are going to give you a good, bad, or ugly. They're going to give you like a drop list of options, or they're going to say, rank it from 1 to 5. That is just not enough to determine how good a source is for a particular use. What you're actually going to need, and these items are based on the Genealogical Proof Standard, the BCG, Board for Certification of Genealogists. This is how they say a source should be properly documented as to how good the source is for what you're using it for. First thing is about the source itself, the actual paper, the book, the whatever. Is this source in its first recorded form, or is this extracted, transcribed, or otherwise derived from the original? So, for example, if you happen to have an original copy of the census or a photocopy is considered an original, then you would say this is in its first recorded form. If that census record has been indexed or transcribed or otherwise manipulated, in other words, the data from the original was taken out and put into another form, then you're going to say that is a derivative. These next two items, the information and the evidence, are specific to what you're actually using this source for. So the source is about the book or the record or whatever. The information is going to be, was this information in this source provided by somebody who was actually there, who had first-hand knowledge? Okay, so for example, let's say you have a birth certificate. Okay, is that birth certificate primary or is it secondary? Okay, the answer is it could be either. Okay, if you're using that birth certificate to show that child's birth date or birthplace, then it was probably primary. The person who actually filled out that birth certificate most likely had first-hand knowledge. But if you're using that birth certificate as proof towards the father's birthplace, that is going to be secondary because the person who filled out that birth certificate was not there when dad was born. Okay, so that's going to depend on what information you're actually taking out of the source. Finally, the evidence is going to basically let you tell whether or not this source actually answers that question, or if it's relevant, or if you expected to find that information in the source, but it's not really there. Okay, so for example, if you're trying to use this source to prove his birth date, if that source actually specifically says, here is the day, month, and year, if it actually says this is the date, that's direct evidence. If it says it was around this time, that's indirect. Okay, in other words, that's relevant. It helps you to prove that, but you need more information for the specifics. And if you were looking at this certificate expecting that it would show you a particular piece of information and it doesn't show you that, then that's going to be negative. Okay, so that's what your quality is going to be used for. Finally, the repository, this is going to let you say where I found this source. I found it in this person's possession. I found it at these archives. I found it at this library. I found it wherever. There's two of them, so you can actually have a primary and a secondary repository. If you happen to have a certified copy, if you've got a copy of a source, you might put yourself down as that secondary repository as somebody who has a copy of that source. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to hop back out of here. I'm going to do one last thing. We are going to show you now, we're going to go into the burial, and we don't have a source. Let's say the burial is in the same source as this death, and the death was on page 105. Let's say it mentions the death and burial. I'm going to go into the burial, and instead of adding a new source, I'm going to cite an existing source. and I'm going to go ahead and pick that same book, the Big Book of Smiths. So I'm going to pick a book that already exists. You'll notice the master source is already filled out. That's the advantage of having a master source and giving your master sources a name. And there's that name that you would have given that source so that it would have sorted all your books together and then by title. And you can change it here. Keep in mind, though, if you change anything in that master source, every place this book is used, it's going to be changed for them. So if you discover that the published date was actually 1985, you can go ahead and change it right there, and it's going to be changed to 1985 every place that that book is used. And we're going to say it happens to have been on page 105 as well. I could go into the detail text and enter any research notes about that, but I'm not going to bother with that right now. And I have now reused that source and had that as well. Okay, now what I'm going to do is, you'll see now that we have the sources listed there, and as I hover, it shows you that I now have the Book of Smiths as a source. Okay, now I'm going to take a little bit of change. I'm going to go into the menus. I'm going to go to lists, and I'm going to go to the source list. And when I go into the source list, you'll see this is a list of all my sources, and I'm going to go ahead and edit this source. Now, if you remember what this looked like before, the last time we were in a screen that looked like this, there was a green section down here which was labeled Source Details. And there were actually a couple of extra tabs. There was a tab besides Master Text that said Detail Text, and there was a tab that said Quality. Now you'll notice that those are not here. That is because we are editing this source from the master source list. The master source list is a list of all sources that I have used here in the program, here in RootsMagic. It's a list of all those sources. And so when I go in to edit, when I go in here to edit this source, I'm not going to see all of the specific detail information. I'm only going to see that information about page number when I'm actually working with that source being used in a particular instance. So that's why I don't have page number, because this source may have been used in 100 different places, and so I don't have page 100, page 105, page 10, whatever. It's not going to list all those details. Now, the same thing with the detailed text. That detailed text is specific to how the source is used, and that quality is based on how the source is used. That information and evidence we talked about is specific to how that source is used. But I can go in here and edit anything about the source. You'll notice that published date is now 1985 because we had changed it in the one instance. And as I mentioned, anytime you change anything about the master source, it's going to be changed in all instances. I can enter anything about the master source. This applies to the source as a whole. I can work with adding images to the general source. This would be pictures of the book, things like that. And then the repositories, the places where this source is actually stored. Okay, now I'm going to show you one last thing from the master source list. If you want to see every place that this source is used, highlight that source and click Print. When you click Print, RootsMagic is going to give you a couple of options. Print all the sources in the whole database, or print a single source, and it's going to default to this one that we've got highlighted. And that's the one we want. And we can have it print the source text and comments, but this is the part that you're going to really be interested in. This is going to be the citation details. In other words, every place this source is used. So when I generate this report, this is going to be my master source. There's the footnote for it. There's the repository for it. And here are the citations. Okay, and I told it to kind of include everything. So it shows that Howard Smith, his birth, is on page 100 of this source. Here's the quality because I asked it to show me the quality. Here is the detailed text for that. Okay, that's going to be the research notes and my comments about it. Then I also show that this source was used for his burial and for his death on page 105, and it shows the quality there as well. So this is a good little tool if I want to see every place that a particular source is used. Okay, now I'm actually going to wrap this up, and I'm going to show you two reports that use sources. So I'm going to go into reports. Okay, that's going to be the little printer button on the toolbar, and these reports are under the research reports category. And the first one I'm going to show you is going to be the source list. And when I do that, this is that same report we showed you before where you could select a single source and it would show you everywhere it was used. But as I mentioned, you can also say print all my sources, and you can choose whether to sort it by the source name or the bibliography or the source file number. So if you have been adding your own file numbers to your sources, you can have it sort by that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and generate this. And what RootsMagic is going to do is it is going to list all of my sources sorted alphabetically. It's going to show you my footnote and my comments about the source. And then it's going to show you all the citations, every place that this source is used. So for example, the ancestral file, I might see that I have 5 different citations along with the quality and any of the, as much detail or as little detail as I want for that. The last report I'm going to show you is your research notes report. Okay, the research notes report is a very handy report, and you can print your research notes for a person or for a family. And if you do it for a family, it's going to do it for all the people in that. So if you select to do research notes for a person, you're going to choose which person. If you choose to do it for a family, this will change to let you select which family. I'm just going to go ahead and do the one for Howard Smith. And what the research notes do is takes every source that you have for a person and will print those sources chronologically, in other words, by date. It's going to start with your earliest and go to your latest, and it's going to print out those research notes that you have entered for each source. In other words, as you have transcribed or extracted information from a source, it's going to show you that information for each source chronologically, and then it will also include the comments. Now you have a couple of options to choose only sources with research notes, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you do it, if you leave this out, it's going to show you every source, whether it has research notes or not, but I'm going to happen to just leave this for now. And I'm going to generate the report. And so you're going to get a report that looks like this. It's going to go down and it's going to sort by date. It's going to list the date, the place for a particular event, and it's going to print the research notes. So this is actually tied to his birth, okay? And it's going to say the following is from an entry in Melanie's journal. I delivered Howard during a blinding snowstorm. The doctor couldn't get here through the snow. And there's going to be a little reference. You see the little 1 right there because the source is going to be listed right down here. So all of your sources are going to be listed as footnotes, but this is for your research notes. And then you're going to have any comments. Melanie's assumed to be Melanie Smith, Howard's older sister. Okay, then it's going to go on to the next one. This was a census. Okay, Howard Smith, male, age 18, born in Iowa, occupation was student, and you're going to have your reference, which is going to come down here and show the specific source reference there as a footnote. And then there's going to be any comments. Okay, this is your research notes are going to be stuff you pulled directly out of that source. Your comments are going to be any comments you have about there. Howard was living in his parents' household in that census. Okay, so this can be a very powerful report to help you keep track of the research along with your sources. Now I see a question: how are the research notes here different from the research notes in the Research Manager? Okay, the difference is going to be these research notes are going to be the research notes that you have extracted from sources showing information that you have added in sources for each event in your database. The Research Manager is going to be able to include sources that maybe you haven't even looked at, sources that you want to look at. In other words, you may have sources that you want to look at that you haven't ever even looked at. And so the Research Manager, the research logs help you keep track of that. Okay, so that's an overview of the new features relating to sources in RootsMagic 5. As I mentioned, we kind of breezed through a lot of this. There are features beyond this, the ability to copy and paste citations, a lot of these things which are covered in the full RootsMagic source webinar, which if you go to our rootsmagic.com/webinars page, you'll be able to see, you'll be able to find the general sources webinar, which will go into detail on those features. This was intended to kind of give you an overview of the new features in RootsMagic 5. So, Mike, so are there any questions that we need to cover?
There are lots of general source questions. Let's see. What am I up here?
Okay, I see one, the source report. I assume they mean the source list. Does it group by master source, or can it separate by source detail? It's going to group by the master source. So each source is going to be its own item. You can sort it by the name of the master source, the bibliography, or the source record number or source reference number. Okay, I see a question. What's the difference between multi-cite and memorize? Those are actually, that's covered in the other one. Quickly, multi-cite lets you select a bunch of people and it will add a source as a general source to a bunch of people. Memorize lets you memorize a citation, which includes the master source and the source details, and you can go into another person and you basically can paste that in one at a time. So memorize lets you go down to the citation level and paste it in one at a time to a specific fact or whatever. Multi-cite adds it generally all at once. Okay. So are there any questions specific to some of the things we covered here? It looks like, do favorites carry over with the database so they show up when you open the database using a different computer? The answer is, I think so. I'd actually have to go in there and try that. I'm almost positive that those favorites are stored in the database so that when you open that database on another computer, it is stored with the database itself. Okay, is it possible to rename a source? You can rename the master source. If you go in to the master source list and edit a source, you will see when you go into edit, the very top row will be the name. So if I go into master sources, if I come in here and edit that, I can change that master source name right there. Okay. Like I say, in terms of general source questions, I would refer you to the general source webinar. I do see another one. Can the research notes and comments just as easily be included in a note? You could include those in the note. The problem is if you do that, you can't use the research notes report. Those notes become attached to the fact rather than to the source. So if you want those notes, those research notes and research comments to be attached to the fact so they carry along, or excuse me, to be attached to the source so they carry along with the source itself or that citation, then you would want to add them as research notes on the source rather than just general notes. Okay. Let me look real quickly and see if there's any others here. Okay. I see one question, and I will wrap it up on this one. Will you please teach a class on which source to choose from the 500 choices? That's actually probably a very good idea. We will look into doing a webinar where we actually kind of give you some hints on how to choose which source type might work the best. We can't specifically tell you because obviously it depends on what your actual source is, but there are some little tips that we can give you to help you, to help it make it easier for you to find and make those choices as to which source. And so we will look at doing one of these mini webinars on doing that. So hopefully you've enjoyed the webinar, this mini source webinar. Like I say, we worked really hard to try to make the sources more accessible, easier to use, because we feel it's very important for users to actually document that. We don't want sources to become so cumbersome that people just say, you know, I'd rather just not even put it in. We want to make it as easy as possible, and so hopefully we're getting there. Hopefully, I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and hope you come and visit with us next week and every week as we continue to show you new and better ways to use RootsMagic. Thanks for joining us.